Welcome back to Close Up. As the country ushers in a new president, we also want to take some time this morning to discuss New Hampshire's role in President Trump's success in getting into office and how the state's primary played into that. With me to discuss that is Neil Levesque of the New Hampshire Institute of Politics and reporter emeritus of New Hampshire of WMUR, John DeStaso. Thanks for being here, gentlemen. First, Neil, put this in context for us. They say, New Hampshire picks presidents, and certainly we did in this case.
Sure. He was really an upset candidate. The money at the early game was on people like Jeb Bush, and Trump wasn't supposed to win the primary. He wouldn't even make it to the primary. A lot of people didn't think that he would make it to the New Hampshire primary, and yet he did, and he won big, and he's very grateful to the people of New Hampshire because of that victory. And on it goes. So he was underestimated from the very start, and today was a day where he really got to claim victory.
John, 10 New Hampshire primaries that you've covered. Anything like this where we've gone from media mogul and real estate icon to presidency via the New Hampshire primary?
Well, not quite anything like Donald Trump, no doubt about that. New Hampshire primary has been the kickoff for several presidents, whether they've won or in the case of Bill Clinton in 1992, where he was the comeback kid and parlayed a second place finish into eventually a presidency. George H.W. Bush in 1988 was vice president, but he was down, and then he ended up winning the New Hampshire primary, and that put him into the presidency. But no, nothing like this. I don't think either of us have ever seen, and we probably never will again. What a grassroots. They said he had no grassroots here in New Hampshire, but he maybe didn't need the official, what we think of as grassroots. He just had a big following, and especially on the Republican and Independent side, winning that primary by a 2-to-1 margin.
Yeah, he rewrote the playbook essentially, but then it's hard to imagine anyone else following the Trump playbook and having the same kind of success. Neil, let's unpack the inaugural speech, the address. What did you hear and what did you not hear in this address?
Well, this was certainly a patriotic, sort of America First speech. And it wasn't sort of necessarily uplifting. It was sort of a command. If you took away some of the points from the very beginning about Justice Roberts, you really could take that speech and pluck it out of many of the campaign speeches that he did across the country. So there wasn't a lot of deviation from that, no surprises necessarily. And it was fairly straightforward. I thought he talked directly to his supporters and the people out there, as he did during the campaign. The Twitter phenomenon that he's done, he really changed the way candidates communicated with their voters. He can communicate directly with the people, and I think that that's going to be really where the source of his power is.
Mm-hmm. And John, this idea of the American carnage ends now. What were you thinking when he said that?
Well, at that point in the speech, I thought, boy, it's kind of dark, painting a bleak picture. But then he kind of turned it into, what he views as a very bright future, an America's first future, a future where, as he put, the people are finally going to be paraphrasing, the rulers. He used the word rulers of the country. It was interesting that, the entire Washington establishment was sitting up there on that stage while he just blasted them, took them apart, and didn't, no one flinched. There was none of that sort of, a lot of the media were hoping, I guess, that he was going to outreach and be more, less confrontational, but that didn't occur. That's not Donald Trump. He was himself.
You mentioned the Washington establishment. So much of what Donald Trump was able to do was resetting the battlefield, sort of this mobile warfare, and he was all over the place. Now he settles into Washington, this trench warfare of legislating in Congress. It's a process that you're familiar with, Neil. What's going to happen to Donald Trump as he has to govern?
This is the difficult thing, because change, of course, is a very subjective thing. So he's going to start working with Congress, trying to pass some bills, and in that first 100 days, there's going to be a lot of people who say, wait a second, I didn't realize he was for that. I didn't realize this was going to happen. So we're going to see, I think, probably a lot of people's sort of eyes open. They're going to move very quickly. They know they have a short window. On Monday, they're going to really start doing some executive orders and trying to move things along. They know that that window is small, so they've got to have a lot of action really quickly.
And John, there's some distance between congressional Republicans and President Trump. Do we start to see those cracks emerge here?
Yeah, I think we're going to. I think, again, Trump is more populist. I think he talks about huge infrastructure investments and that sort of thing, as he talked about on Friday. Where is that money going to come from? A lot of times what happens is when two parties, when one party rules, so to speak, there is an institutional rivalry that occurs. We see that right up here at the State House once in a while. We haven't yet this year, but we have in the past, and we very well may see that and have seen that in Washington. We saw it when Obama first took office. He was unable to get Obamacare through immediately with the Congress that was all Democratic.
Mm-hmm. And Neil, having operated in that world of Congress, sometimes your friends are your worst enemies.
Absolutely. You know what? I think a lot of people don't realize that in politics, not only do Democrats and Republicans fight, but just as much fighting goes on within the party, just as John explained. And we're going to probably see a lot of that if it's not already going on.
Everyone wants to put their stamp on it. I'm just going to say,
yeah.
You know, Trump is obviously the 800-pound gorilla. He's the big guy. But the House and the Senate, Republicans, don't want to be just rubber stamps either. They want to put their signature on some of these initiatives.
Yeah, and Obamacare certainly up first as a big issue to tackle. Gentlemen, thanks so much for your time and your insight. Much appreciated.